The winter of 2006 was unforgiving, with temperatures plunging far below freezing and the wind howling like an enraged beast. The small mountain town of Kessler's Hollow lay blanketed in thick snow, its residents huddling indoors against the biting cold. The blizzard that had rolled in the previous night was said to be the worst in decades, and no one dared venture out. But there were whispers. Hushed voices passed between shivering mouths of something stalking the storm. Young Tommy Keene sat by the window of his family's modest cabin, the frosted glass obscuring his view of the swirling snow outside. His mother, Agnes, sat scrolling through her old flip phone, anxiously checking for updates about the storm. They were alone this Christmas Eve. Tommy's father had been deployed overseas, leaving the two to fend for themselves. "Don't stay by the window too long, Tommy," Agnes warned, her voice a strained whisper. "There's something in this storm." The old folks in town used to say the blizzard brings more than just snow. Tommy turned his wide, innocent eyes to her. "What do you mean, Mama?" She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she put down the phone. "Just don't let the wind take your name, darling. And for heaven's sake, be good tonight. The bad ones are always the first to go." Tommy didn't understand, but the tone of her voice silenced any further questions. As the hours passed, the storm grew fiercer. The wind battered the cabin, causing the walls to groan under the pressure. Then came the scratching, a faint, deliberate sound at first, like branches tapping against the wood. "Just the wind," Agnes muttered to herself, clutching the rosary she kept hanging in the kitchen. But Tommy wasn't so sure. He pressed his ear to the cold door and froze. The scratching was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. "Mama," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. Before Agnes could respond, the scratching turned into pounding. Heavy, deliberate thuds echoed through the cabin, rattling the windows and shaking the door. Agnes grabbed Tommy and pulled him away from the entrance. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice rising in panic. The pounding stopped. Silence enveloped the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. Agnes dared to approach the door, her heart pounding in her chest. And then a voice. "Tommy, Tommy Keene." It was a low, guttural growl that barely resembled human speech. Tommy's blood ran cold. The voice was outside, yet it seemed to echo from within the very walls. "Mama, it knows my name," he whimpered, tears streaming down his cheeks. Agnes's face turned ashen. She grabbed a poker from the fireplace and backed away from the door. "Don't answer it! Don't you dare answer it!" The wind outside howled louder, almost drowning out the voice as it repeated, "Tommy Keene, naughty little Tommy Keene." Suddenly the door burst open, snow and ice swirling into the room. Standing in the doorway was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its massive horns curling menacingly against the backdrop of the blizzard. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, and its maw was lined with jagged teeth. Chains clinked around its body as it dragged a massive sack behind it. "Krampus," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. The creature stepped into the cabin, its hooves clacking against the wooden floor. It sniffed the air, its gaze locking onto Tommy. Agnes lunged forward with the poker, but the beast swatted her aside with a casual flick of its clawed hand. She slammed into the wall and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Tommy screamed, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of the storm. Krampus loomed over him, its sack opening wide to reveal countless writhing children, their faces frozen in eternal terror. The stench of decay filled the room as the beast grabbed Tommy with one massive hand. "Not good enough," it rumbled, its voice reverberating through Tommy's very bones. The boy struggled, tears streaming down his face as he pleaded for mercy, but Krampus showed none. It stuffed him into the sack, his screams joining the chorus of others trapped within. The last thing Tommy saw before darkness consumed him was his mother stirring, her face twisted in horror as she reached out for him. And then, silence. When Agnes awoke, the storm had passed. The cabin was eerily still, the door hanging ajar. Outside, the snow was pristine, undisturbed save for the massive hoofprints leading away from the cabin and vanishing into the forest. Tommy was gone. For years, the townsfolk whispered about that fateful Christmas Eve, about how the storm had brought with it the wrath of Krampus. And every Christmas thereafter, parents in Kessler's Hollow would warn their children, "Be good, or the storm will come for you." The blizzards returned each winter, but no one ever saw Tommy again. Some say he's still out there, trapped in Krampus's sack, forever punished for sins he didn't understand. And the wind, it still whispers names. It was the dead of night on Christmas Eve in 2003, when the small town of Blackridge was consumed by a winter storm so fierce it seemed like nature itself was raging. The power had gone out hours earlier, leaving homes bathed in candlelight as the blizzard outside screamed through the forested hills. Snowdrifts climbed halfway up the doors, and icicles as long as swords dangled precariously from every rooftop. The Sutton family, Emma, her teenage son Caleb, and their dog Daisy, were huddled around the fireplace in their old, creaky cabin at the edge of town. The storm was bad enough, but there had been unsettling rumors circulating in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Hunters and hikers reported finding strange tracks in the woods, large and human-like, but with claws. Some claimed they'd seen a figure moving through the trees, a tall, gaunt man with glowing blue eyes, wrapped in tattered robes that fluttered even when the air was still. The townsfolk called it the Frost Revenant, an ancient spirit said to awaken when the snowstorms were the harshest. Legend had it that the Revenant preyed on the ungrateful, the selfish, and those who had forsaken the spirit of Christmas. Emma didn't believe in such things, but she couldn't shake the unease the stories brought. As the wind howled outside, a sound like breaking glass echoed from the back of the house. Caleb looked up from his book, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Emma forced a smile. "It's probably just the wind knocking something loose. Stay here, I'll check." Daisy, the family's German shepherd, growled low in her throat as Emma grabbed a flashlight and headed down the dark hallway. The air seemed colder away from the fire, and her breath puffed out in white clouds. She reached the kitchen and froze. The back door was open, snow swirling in across the floor. "Caleb, did you leave this door unlocked?" she called, her voice trembling. "No, I swear," came his reply from the living room. Emma stepped toward the door, her heart pounding. Outside, the snow was pristine, except for a single trail of enormous footprints leading away from the house and into the woods. The prints were deep, clawed, and far too large to be human. Daisy barked sharply, racing to the doorway and snarling at the trees. Caleb appeared behind Emma, his face stricken. "Mom, what is that?" Before she could answer, A shadow moved in the tree line. Emma flicked her flashlight toward it, the beam catching a glimpse of something tall and skeletal, its face pale and hollow, its eyes glowing an unearthly blue. The Frost Revenant. "Get back inside," Emma yelled, slamming the door shut and locking it. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof, followed by the scratching of claws against the shingles. Caleb screamed, and Daisy barked ferociously as Emma grabbed the fire poker. The lights flickered back on for a split second, revealing the figure standing outside the front window. It was impossibly tall, its icy robes billowing in an unseen wind, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, lined with jagged icicle-like teeth. It raised a long, bony finger and pointed directly at Caleb. The boy stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. "Why is it looking at me?" he cried. Emma moved to shield him, holding the poker defensively. "Stay behind me, Caleb." The Revenant's hand pressed against the glass, frost spreading outward like spider webs. The temperature in the room plummeted, the fire in the hearth sputtering and dying as the creature's hand shattered the window. Its long arms snaked through the opening, clawing at the air as it reached for Caleb. Daisy lunged at the creature, biting into its icy flesh. The Revenant let out an ear-piercing screech, yanking its arm back and dragging the dog through the broken window. Emma screamed as Daisy's barks faded into the storm. "We have to run." Emma grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him toward the back of the house. They fled through the kitchen, out the still-open back door, and into the freezing night. Snow stung their faces as they stumbled toward the neighbor's house, but the storm was so thick they could barely see a few feet ahead. The footsteps behind them were slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow with a dreadful rhythm. Emma turned and saw the Revenant emerging from the blizzard, its glowing eyes cutting through the dark. "You can't take him," she screamed, hurling the fire poker. It struck the creature's chest and shattered into pieces of ice. Caleb tripped, falling into the snow. The Revenant loomed over him, its claws stretching wide, but instead of attacking, it spoke, its voice like wind whistling through a frozen graveyard. "Unworthy," it hissed, pointing at Caleb again. Emma threw herself in front of her son. "He's just a kid. Leave him alone." The Revenant paused, its head tilting as if considering her plea. Then it turned its glowing gaze to Emma. The price must be paid. Before she could react, the creature seized her, its icy grip burning her skin. Emma screamed as frost crept up her arms, her breath turning into choking gasps of mist. "Run, Caleb," she managed to say, before her body froze completely, her face locked in a final expression of terror. Caleb staggered to his feet, tears streaming down his face as the Revenant dragged his frozen mother into the blizzard. The storm swallowed them both, leaving Caleb alone in the snow. The next morning, when the storm finally cleared, search parties found Caleb wandering the forest, frostbitten and delirious. He spoke of the Frost Revenant, of its glowing eyes and its chilling demand for a price. No one believed him, at least not officially. But the residents of Blackridge made sure to be kinder, more grateful, and more generous every Christmas after that. Because when the blizzards came, they knew the Frost Revenant might come, too, and it always took what it was owed. It was December 23rd, 1998, and the tiny town of Hollow Creek was drowning under a relentless snowstorm. It was the kind of storm that made you question the safety of even stepping outside. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow, and the town's streets were ghostly quiet. The weather wasn't unusual for Hollow Creek, but the chilling stories about one particular house near the edge of town were. The Johnson house had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging from neglect. Yet every Christmas season, a single light would appear in the window, a faint, flickering glow that no one dared to investigate. The local kids called it the Ghost House, and tales of strange noises and sightings were whispered around campfires for years. Evelyn Carter had always dismissed the stories as nonsense. A practical 34-year-old mother of two, she wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. But when her 7-year-old son, Max, begged to explore the house during their walk home from picking up groceries, she hesitated. The sight of the flickering light in the window piqued her curiosity, despite her better judgment. "Just for a minute," Evelyn said, clutching Max's hand tightly. "We look from the outside, and then we go home. Deal?" Max grinned and nodded, his wide eyes filled with excitement. The snow crunched under their boots as they approached the decrepit house. The closer they got, the colder Evelyn felt, as if the air around the house had its own unnatural chill. The flickering light came from the second-floor window, a faint orange glow that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. As they reached the porch, Max stopped abruptly. "Mom, do you hear that?" Evelyn froze, listening intently. At first there was only the sound of the wind. Then she heard it, a faint jingling sound like bells. But it wasn't cheerful or festive. It was discordant, off-key, and seemed to come from deep within the house. "Let's go," Evelyn said, gripping Max's hand tightly. But before she could turn, the door creaked open. It wasn't a sudden slam or a violent movement. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was inviting them in. "Hello?" Evelyn called, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound firm. There was no response, just the low jingling of the bells. Against her better judgment, Evelyn stepped onto the creaking floorboards, Max following close behind. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the kind of cold that settled into your bones. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and the faint glow from upstairs lit the hallway in an eerie orange hue. "Stay close," Evelyn whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. As they moved deeper into the house, the jingling grew louder, and Evelyn realized it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the living room. She turned the corner cautiously, her breath catching at what she saw. In the center of the room stood a Christmas tree, impossibly pristine despite the state of the house. Its branches glistened with frost, and its ornaments gleamed unnaturally, as if freshly polished. A single ornament at the very top seemed to pulse with the same orange glow they'd seen from outside. Max tugged on her coat. "Mom, look." She followed his gaze and saw a series of photographs tucked into the branches of the tree. They were old, faded Polaroids of people, men, women, and children, all smiling, but their eyes were wide with terror. "Max, we're leaving," Evelyn said firmly, pulling him back toward the door. But as they turned, the door slammed shut, and the sound of jingling bells surrounded them. The lights on the tree began to flicker, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The orange glowing ornament pulsed faster now, and Evelyn swore she saw something moving within its surface. A reflection, perhaps, but not of them. It was a dark figure, hunched and clawed, its head twisting unnaturally as it gazed back at them. "Mom." Max's voice was barely a whisper. The jingling grew deafening, and the photographs on the tree began to change. The faces of the people blurred, their smiles melting into twisted screams. Then, one by one, the pictures began to vanish, replaced by new ones. Evelyn's breath hitched as she recognized the faces in the new photographs. Hers. Max's. The ornament at the top of the tree began to crack, thin fissures spreading across its surface as the glow intensified. From within, something began to emerge, a clawed hand, thin and bony, reaching out toward them. Evelyn grabbed Max and ran, pulling him toward the boarded-up window. She grabbed a broken chair and hurled it at the glass, shattering it with a deafening crash. The freezing wind and snow poured into the room as she hoisted Max through the opening. "Run!" she screamed, shoving him into the snow. Max scrambled to his feet, but when he turned to help his mother, she was gone. The room was empty, the tree dark and lifeless. The jingling bells had stopped. Max stood there, crying and calling for her, but there was no answer. The house remained silent and still, the broken window sealing itself shut as if it had never been touched. When the search party found Max the next morning, he was freezing and delirious, rambling about the tree and the glowing ornament. No one believed him. No one, that is, until the Johnson house lit up again the next Christmas, and another child went missing. They say the ornament still glows, and the photographs on the tree still change, waiting for the next victim to complete its collection. And if you hear jingling bells on a silent night in Hollow Creek, don't investigate. You might not come back. It started with the singing. On Christmas Eve of 2015, the quiet mountain town of Snowbridge was buried under an unrelenting snowstorm. The streets were silent, save for the occasional howling wind that shook the homes and rattled the nerves of those inside. Families sat by their fireplaces, exchanging gifts and trying to ignore the strange power outage that had left the town bathed in an unnatural darkness since sundown. Rebecca Hargrove sat with her daughter Lily in their modest living room. They had wrapped themselves in blankets, the only light coming from a row of flickering candles on the mantel. Rebecca smiled faintly at Lily's excitement over her new doll, trying to suppress her growing unease. Something about the storm felt wrong. Then they heard it. Faint singing from outside. It was a soft, melodic hum at first, barely audible over the howling wind. Rebecca froze, straining to hear. The song grew louder, rising in harmony. Several voices, rich and angelic. It was a Christmas carol, though not one she recognized. The words were foreign, sung in a hauntingly beautiful language that sent shivers down her spine. "Mom," Lily whispered, clutching her doll. "Who's singing?" Rebecca moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. The street outside was empty, the snow falling thick and heavy. But the singing continued, the voices growing closer. She shut the curtain tightly and stepped back. "It's just the wind," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Let's stay inside." The singing didn't stop. It grew louder and clearer until it seemed to be coming from their own front yard. Rebecca's stomach twisted as she realized the voices were not muffled by the walls of the house. They were sharp, distinct, as if the singers were standing right there with them. A knock came at the door, 3 soft taps, perfectly in rhythm with the melody. "Mom." Lily's voice was trembling now. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. "Stay here," she whispered, picking up the fireplace poker as she moved toward the door. She peeked through the peephole, her breath catching. Standing on the porch was a group of figures dressed in old-fashioned winter coats, their faces obscured by heavy scarves and hoods. They held candles that flickered eerily despite the raging wind. Their heads were tilted back, mouths wide open in song, but something about their movements was unnatural. Their jaws stretched too far, their necks bending at impossible angles as they harmonized in a language that seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly resonance. Rebecca stepped back, her hands trembling. "Go away!" she shouted, but the singers didn't react. Their song grew louder, more urgent. The knock came again. 3 taps, sharper this time. Rebecca turned to Lily. "Go to your room, now." "But Mom." "Now." Rebecca's tone brooked no argument. Lily scrambled upstairs, her footsteps echoing through the house. Rebecca braced herself and opened the door a crack, gripping the poker tightly. The cold wind blasted into the room, carrying the song with it. The figures on the porch turned their heads toward her, their movements disjointed, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. "What do you want?" she demanded. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. One of the figures stepped forward, the glow of their candle revealing a glimpse of their face beneath the hood. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. The eyes were pitch black, like bottomless voids, and the mouth. It was impossibly wide, filled with teeth that glistened like shards of ice. The figure smiled, tilting its head as if amused. "Join us," it said, its voice layered with an echo that seemed to reverberate inside her skull. Rebecca slammed the door and locked it, her heart hammering. She backed away as the singing resumed, louder and more chaotic now. The voices clashed, the harmony breaking into a discordant cacophony that made her ears ache. From upstairs, Lily screamed. Rebecca bolted up the stairs, the sound of her daughter's cries fueling her panic. She burst into Lily's room and froze. The window was wide open, snow swirling into the room. Lily was gone. "Lily!" Rebecca screamed, leaning out into the storm. The street below was empty, save for the faint footprints leading toward the woods. The singing was everywhere now, surrounding her, inside her. She stumbled down the stairs, desperate to follow the tracks, but the front door was wide open. The figures stood in the doorway, their candles casting unnatural shadows across the walls. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices piercing and sweet. Rebecca swung the poker at the nearest figure, but it passed through them as if they were smoke. They stepped closer, their black eyes glinting with cruel delight. Rebecca fell to her knees, clutching her head as the song consumed her mind. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Lily's voice, singing softly along with the choir. The next morning the storm cleared, and the town of Snowbridge was eerily quiet. Rebecca, Lily, and the other residents of their street were never found. But every Christmas Eve since, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, the singing returns. And if you're foolish enough to open your door, you might find yourself joining the choir. In 1992, the small town of Winter Hollow was buried under the kind of snowstorm that left the streets abandoned and the air heavy with silence. The storm began on December 22nd and showed no signs of relenting. trapping the townspeople in their homes as temperatures dropped dangerously low. 13-year-old Ellie Harper sat in her family's drafty living room, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of cocoa. Her younger brother, Toby, played with a set of wooden blocks near the flickering fireplace. Their father, a long-haul trucker, was away, and their mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a modest Christmas Eve dinner. It was a quiet, uneventful evening, until the knock at the door. It was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Ellie and Toby froze. Their home was at the edge of town, and no one in their right mind would brave the storm to visit. Who could that be? Toby whispered, his voice quivering. Ellie set her mug down and moved to the window, peeking through the frosted glass. The snow was falling heavily, but she could just make out a figure standing on their porch, hunched and unmoving. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, draped in a long, tattered coat. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and he carried a large, square box wrapped in crimson paper with a black satin bow. "Don't open it," Toby hissed, clutching one of his blocks like a talisman. But before Ellie could respond, her mother appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Who's at the door?" "I don't know," Ellie whispered. "Should we answer?" Her mother hesitated, glancing toward the door. The knocking came again, 3 deliberate raps that seemed to echo unnaturally in the room. "Stay here," her mother said firmly, moving to the door. She opened it just a crack, the cold wind howling as it rushed into the house. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone wary. The man didn't answer. He extended the crimson-wrapped box toward her, his gloved hands steady. For a moment he stood there, motionless before turning and walking away, disappearing into the storm. Ellie's mother shut the door quickly, her face pale. She set the box on the coffee table, staring at it as if it might spring to life. "What is it?" Ellie asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. Her mother shook her head. "I don't know, but we're not opening it." That night, after her mother and Toby had gone to bed, Ellie sat in the living room, unable to stop staring at the box. Something about it drew her in, a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. Against her better judgment, she reached for the black satin bow, her fingers trembling as she tugged it loose. The box fell open. Inside was a doll, its porcelain face painted with delicate precision. Its glass eyes were unnervingly lifelike, staring up at her with an intensity that made her shiver. It was dressed in an ornate black and crimson gown, its tiny hands folded primly in its lap. Ellie felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. She slammed the box shut and shoved it under the couch, her heart racing. But as she turned to go to bed, she heard it, a soft, metallic scraping sound. She spun around. The box had moved. It now sat in the middle of the floor, the lid slightly ajar. The doll's head was tilted upward, its glass eyes fixed directly on Ellie. She screamed, backing away as the doll slowly rose to its feet. Its movements were jerky at first, but it steadied itself, standing unnaturally straight. Its painted lips parted, and a voice, cold and mechanical, echoed through the room. "Thank you for opening the gift." Ellie bolted up the stairs, her screams waking Toby and her mother. They met her in the hallway, and she frantically tried to explain what had happened. Her mother, pale and trembling, grabbed a flashlight and led them back to the living room. The box was gone. The doll was gone. Only a faint trail of melted snow led from the center of the room to the front door, which now stood wide open. The 3 of them huddled together in the kitchen for the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep. By morning, the storm had finally passed, But something far worse had taken its place. Throughout Winter Hollow, families awoke to find crimson-wrapped boxes on their porches. Each contained something different: a toy, a trinket, a doll, but all carried the same curse. Those who opened the boxes were never seen again. Their homes would be found empty, their doors ajar, with trails of melted snow leading into the wilderness. No one knew who the man in the tattered coat was or why he had chosen Winter Hollow. But every Christmas since, the townspeople lock their doors, extinguish their lights, and pray they won't hear a knock at their door. Because once you open the gift, it's already too late. On Christmas Eve of 2010, the quaint village of Frosthaven was blanketed in pristine snow, its cobblestone streets glowing softly under strings of holiday lights. Despite the picturesque scene, the air carried an unnatural stillness. No carolers sang, no children played in the snow, and no laughter echoed from the warm homes. The villagers whispered nervously about the phenomenon they called the Silent Night. It started a year ago, when the bells of St. Agnes Church rang at midnight on Christmas Eve. Families heard something strange. A soft, melodic hum that didn't come from carolers but drifted through the icy air. People who ventured outside to investigate never came back. By morning, their homes were empty, their doors ajar, and faint footprints led into the woods but never returned. Eliza, a 17-year-old with a streak of stubborn defiance, sat with her younger brother Sam by the fireplace. Their parents had left weeks ago for a trip and hadn't returned, leaving the siblings to fend for themselves. Eliza had promised to keep Sam safe, but as the clock neared midnight, she felt a creeping unease. "I'm scared," Sam whispered, clutching his blanket tightly. "It's just a silly story," Eliza reassured him, though she wasn't convinced. She checked the clock, 11:55 p.m. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a hauntingly beautiful melody that floated through the air like snowflakes. It wasn't a Christmas carol. The notes were otherworldly, chilling in their perfection. Eliza felt her chest tighten as the melody grew louder, seeping into the house as if the walls couldn't keep it out. "Eliza," Sam whimpered, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," she said firmly, grabbing the fireplace poker as she moved toward the window. Peeking through the frost-covered glass, she saw nothing but the empty street and the softly falling snow. The music, however, continued to swell. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed unnaturally through the house. "Eliza, don't open it," Sam begged, his voice trembling. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The music outside seemed to harmonize with her pounding heartbeat. Summoning her courage, she flung the door open, poker raised defensively. No one was there, just the snow-covered porch and the icy wind. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and the music grew louder, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. "Eliza." Sam's voice cracked behind her. She turned and froze. Figures were emerging from the street, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though gliding over the snow. They were dressed in tattered, white shrouds, their faces hidden beneath long, dark veils. Their hands, pale and thin, held tarnished silver bells that jingled softly in time with the melody. "Eliza, close the door," Sam screamed. But her body wouldn't obey. The figures were closer now, their bells ringing louder. She could see their veils shifting in the wind, revealing glimpses of hollow eye sockets and grinning mouths filled with jagged teeth. "Eliza," Sam's voice snapped her out of her trance. She slammed the door shut and locked it, dragging a heavy chest in front of it for good measure. The bells didn't stop. They grew louder, accompanied by the scraping of nails against the wooden door. The melody continued, no longer beautiful but twisted and discordant, like 1,000 voices wailing in agony. "Eliza," Sam whimpered. She turned and gasped. The window in the living room was frosted over, but through the thin layer of ice, she could see one of the figures standing outside, its hand pressed against the glass. Its bell was gone, replaced by claws that scratched slow, deliberate lines into the window pane. "We have to go," Eliza whispered, grabbing Sam's hand. The two ran upstairs, barricading themselves in the attic. Eliza pressed her ear against the trap door, listening as the melody filled the house. The scraping against the door below turned into pounding, then silence. For a moment she thought they were safe. Then came the whispering. "Eliza, Sam." The voices were soft, teasing, but they carried the same chilling harmony as the melody. Eliza tightened her grip on the poker, her knuckles white. "Stay behind me," she told Sam. The trapdoor creaked as it slowly began to open. Eliza raised the poker, ready to swing, but what she saw froze her in place. It was her mother. At least it looked like her mother. The figure was gaunt, its skin gray and stretched too tightly over its bones. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural smile as it reached out with long, clawed fingers. Behind it, more figures climbed into the attic, their veils slipping to reveal eyeless faces and gaping maws. "Eliza," the thing that looked like her mother said, its voice echoing with the haunting melody. "Join us." Eliza screamed and swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. Sam grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the small attic window. "We have to jump." "No, Sam, it's too high." "They're coming," he cried, pointing to the figures closing in. Eliza hesitated for only a second before throwing the window open. The icy wind stung her face as she hoisted Sam out and dropped him into the snow below. She climbed through just as the figures reached her, their clawed hands grabbing at her hair and clothes. She fell, landing hard in the snow beside Sam. Gasping, she looked up at the attic window. The figures stared down at them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The bells started again, and the melody echoed through the night as the figures retreated into the shadows. Eliza and Sam ran, their breaths visible in the freezing air. They didn't stop until they reached the village center, where the bells of St. Agnes Church rang out, drowning the haunting melody in their loud, resounding toll. By morning, their house was gone. Not destroyed, gone. In its place was an empty patch of snow, as if it had never existed. The only trace left behind was a single, tarnished silver bell lying in the snow. Every Christmas Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, the bells of St. Agnes Church ring, and the villagers know better than to leave their homes because the silent night might return. And this time, it might not let anyone escape. In Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost point of the United States, winter was an unrelenting beast. By December, the sun had set for the last time that year, leaving the town in total darkness. The temperature hovered below, 40 degrees, and the snowdrifts seemed alive, shifting and swallowing landmarks in the endless night. It was in this desolate town, during the longest night of the year, that an old VHS tape appeared on the doorstep of the Baker family. The case was battered, the label faded, but a single word was scrawled in red ink: play. The Bakers were new to Barrow. Marcus Baker had taken a job repairing communication lines, and his wife, Elaine, worked part-time at the local library. Their teenage daughter, Lily, hated the move, resenting the isolation and the cold. She was the one who found the tape. "Dad, look what I found on the porch," Lily said, holding it up with a gloved hand. "Probably some prank," Marcus muttered, sipping his coffee. But Lily, eager for anything to break the monotony of her frozen existence, insisted they play it. The tape flickered to life on their outdated television. The screen showed a static-laden image of a snow-covered field under a black sky. The camera wobbled as if held by an unsteady hand. "Is this some local art project?" Elaine asked, leaning forward. Then the static faded, replaced by something far more unsettling. A figure appeared on the screen. It was human-shaped, but impossibly tall, its body covered in jagged, frost-coated fur. Its face was obscured by what looked like a mask made of ice, with hollow, gaping holes where the eyes should have been. The figure didn't move, but the camera zoomed closer. A faint, crackling sound came from the TV, like ice splintering under pressure. And then it spoke. "You are invited." The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was the sound of wind screaming through the trees, the groan of icebergs breaking apart, and something deeper, a guttural noise that felt like it resonated within their bones. "What the hell is this?" Marcus said, standing up. The screen went black. Then on their front door, a knock. Marcus froze. No one in Barrow just knocked at night, especially not in the middle of a storm, when being outside for more than a few minutes could mean death. Elaine gasped, "Don't open it." But Marcus, spurred by a mix of curiosity and stubbornness, approached the door. He looked through the peephole. Nothing, just the endless, snow-covered darkness. The knock came again, louder this time. Marcus hesitated but opened the door a crack. There was no one there, only a fresh trail of footprints leading away from the house and into the frozen wilderness. "I'm calling the sheriff," Elaine said, grabbing the phone. Lily, meanwhile, stared at the TV. The tape had ejected itself, but the screen was now filled with static. Slowly, a message appeared, written as if by an invisible hand. "Follow the trail." "No," Lily whispered, shaking her head. "No way." The screen crackled again, and the words changed. "If you don't, it will come to you." The family sat in stunned silence. Outside, the wind howled, and the knock came a third time, harder, more insistent. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It came from the windows, from the back door, from the very walls of the house. "It's surrounding us," Marcus said, grabbing his rifle. The TV flashed again. This time the figure reappeared, its icy mask glowing faintly in the dark. It raised an elongated finger, pointing directly at them through the screen. Decide. They had no choice. Bundling themselves in their thickest gear, they stepped outside into the night, following the trail of footprints. The snow was untouched by the wind, the trail unnervingly precise. The footprints led them to the edge of the tundra, where the town's lights were barely visible behind them. And then they saw it. The figure from the tape stood ahead, its towering form stark against the endless white. Around it, the snow seemed to writhe, forming shapes that looked almost human. Faces emerged briefly before dissolving back into the storm. "You came?" it said, its voice echoing across the icy plain. "Now, join." The Bakers turned to run, but the snow rose around them, pulling them under like quicksand. They screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. When the sun rose months later, the Baker's house stood abandoned. Inside, the VHS tape sat atop their TV, rewound and ready to play. Locals say on the longest night of the year, you can hear their screams carried on the wind. And if you find a strange tape on your porch, don't play it, no matter how curious you are. On December 24, 2006, a fierce blizzard descended upon Bangor, Maine. The kind of storm that piled snow so high it swallowed cars and turned streets into icy mazes. Wind howled like a living thing, shaking the old Victorian houses that lined the quiet neighborhoods. The Taylor family, like many others, gathered inside their home, shielded from the storm's fury. Their house, a sprawling Victorian with creaky floors and drafty windows, was lit by the soft glow of Christmas lights. Snow lashed against the panes, but inside, the family was warm, surrounded by the scent of pine and cinnamon. This Christmas was special for one reason. Cousin Greg was coming. Greg hadn't been seen in almost a decade. He was the quiet, awkward cousin who always lingered in the background at family gatherings. No one had heard from him in years, so when he called unexpectedly, saying he wanted to join for the holidays, the Taylors were delighted. When Greg arrived, the wind was howling and snow swirled in chaotic flurries. He stepped through the door carrying a single duffel bag. His coat was too thin for the weather, and his face was pale, almost gaunt. Still, he smiled warmly and handed out small gifts: a hand-carved ornament for Aunt Judy, a tin of rare tea for Uncle Frank, and a vintage music box for little Lily. Despite his smile, Greg seemed different. He spoke softly, his eyes lingering on family members just a moment too long. When he sat by the fire, he watched the others in silence, his presence both unremarkable and unsettling. That night, as the storm raged outside, the strangeness began. Uncle Frank opened his tin of tea, only to find it filled with dead insects. "What kind of joke is this?" he demanded, but Greg simply shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smile. Later, Lily wound up her music box, but instead of a cheerful melody, it played a warped, discordant tune. The spinning ballerina inside was grotesque, its limbs twisted unnaturally. Lily screamed and dropped it. Greg, tilting his head, said, "How odd. It wasn't like that when I got it." By Christmas Eve night, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The power flickered, the furnace groaned, and strange noises echoed through the halls. Footsteps where no one walked, faint whispers behind closed doors. Sarah, one of the cousins, voiced her discomfort. "Something's wrong with Greg," she whispered to her brother Tom. "Don't start," Tom replied. "It's just the storm messing with us." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. Every time she passed Greg, she felt his eyes on her. She began locking her bedroom door. By midnight, the power went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. The family gathered in the living room with flashlights, trying to stay calm. Greg was nowhere to be found. When Aunt Judy went to check his room, she found it empty. His duffel bag lay open on the bed. Inside were knives, lengths of rope, and photographs of the Taylor family. Each photo had the eyes scratched out. Panic spread through the house. "Where is he?" Uncle Frank demanded. The answer came when they found Greg standing in the basement, his back to the stairs. The flickering beam of a flashlight illuminated his thin frame. "Greg?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. He turned slowly, holding a knife. His smile was too wide now, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "Merry Christmas," he said softly. Chaos erupted. The Taylors bolted for the stairs, but the door slammed shut, locking them in. Greg moved quickly, his quiet demeanor gone, replaced by something predatory. "You invited me," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You wanted family together for the holidays. Isn't this what you wanted?" The family fought to escape, but Greg had planned everything. He knew the house, the creaky boards, the weak locks, the hidden corners. One by one, the flashlights went out, leaving them in total darkness. The last thing Sarah saw before her light failed was Greg's face, inches from hers, his smile etched with malice. When the blizzard finally subsided the next morning, the house was silent. Snow covered the windows, muffling the world outside. The police arrived after neighbors reported no sign of life from the house. Inside, they found the Taylors, or what was left of them. The walls were marked with cryptic symbols in blood, and the Christmas tree stood in the center of the carnage, decorated with scraps of clothing and locks of hair. Greg was gone. On the tree, a note dangled from a crimson ribbon. "Thanks for making this Christmas unforgettable. See you next year, Greg." Christmas morning in Alta, Utah, was quiet. The heavy snowstorm from the night before, leaving the small mountain town buried under thick drifts. David's cabin, nestled at the edge of the forest, was almost completely surrounded by white. Alone for the holidays, he tried to embrace the solitude, convincing himself that the isolation was a peaceful escape. At 7 a.m., just as he poured himself a second cup of coffee, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. David froze. Who would be out in this weather? The roads were impassable, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The knock came again, louder this time. Peering through the frosted window, he could barely make out a figure bundled in a heavy coat, snow whipping around her. Against his better judgment, David opened the door a crack. A woman stood on the porch, her hood pulled low, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Her face was pale, her cheeks reddened by the cold, and her lips trembled. "Please," she said, her voice weak. "I got lost in the storm. Can I come in?" David hesitated but nodded, stepping aside. "Of course. Come in." The woman entered, pulling back her hood. Her hair was damp and dark, and her eyes seemed almost too wide. "Thank you," she said softly. "Are you hurt?" David asked, grabbing a blanket and draping it over her shoulders. "No," she replied quickly. "Just cold." She glanced around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the Christmas tree in the corner. The lights twinkled faintly, casting soft shadows across the room. "You're alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David stiffened. "How did you know that?" The corners of her lips curved upward into a small, unsettling smile. "Just a guess." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Do you need to call someone?" "No," she said, her tone firm. She stepped toward the tree, running her fingers along one of the ornaments, a small glass angel. "This is beautiful." David's unease deepened. "I think I should drive you to the main lodge," he said, reaching for his coat. She turned to him, her smile widening unnaturally. "Why would you want to leave?" The fire in the hearth sputtered, then extinguished, plunging the room into an icy darkness. The Christmas lights on the tree flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "What's going on?" David demanded, backing toward the kitchen. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes, once wide and bright, now appeared entirely black. "You're the first person to open the door," she said softly. "Do you know how long I've been waiting?" David grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it between them. "Get out." She laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed unnaturally. "You invited me in," she said, her voice layered with something inhuman. "You belong to me now." Her body began to change. Her skin paled to an unnatural gray, her limbs elongating as her smile stretched wider, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The lights on the tree dimmed completely, and the room plunged into darkness. David's scream was cut short. When the storm cleared later that day, David's cabin stood untouched. A single coffee cup sat on the table, still warm. Outside, 2 sets of footprints led from the door to the edge of the woods. One set stopped too abruptly. Since that Christmas, locals in Alta have shared stories of a woman knocking during snowstorms, her voice calling faintly for help. No one knows where she came from or what happens to those who answer.